Well, parties are continuing with talks to form agreements to run dozens of municipalities where they all failed to win a convincing majority. Support for the two largest parties, the ANC and DA, dropped during last week's vote, but they remain the major players in most coalition negotiations. Some analysts believe the best outcome would be agreements between the two if they can manage to put aside their differences and work towards delivering the basic services that some communities have been lacking for decades now. To talk more about this, we're joined by Richard Jurgens. He's the editor of the Africa Governance Papers at Good Governance Africa. Richard, a very good evening to you. Welcome to News at Prime, and thank you for your time. If I can get first your sense of why it is that both the ANC and DA dropped in support this year.
Yes, thanks very much for having me. I'm glad to share my thoughts, my work at GGA, Good Governance Africa, and we've studied the local councils for some years now, aside from my work at the Journal. So I think probably the overall single most important issue with regard to both parties is that core voters, or certainly a substantial number of voters, traditional voters for both parties, are simply losing trust in them. The reason is probably different in each case. With the ANC, the single main reason is probably that the ANC has failed to deliver services. And there was probably a large stay away of some of the party's voters for this reason. With the DA, and the second reason I might add is probably the longer term track record of the party as regards corruption, maladministration, and sometimes outright incompetence. I think their voters have simply lost patience with them, or certainly many of them, enough to make a difference to the results this year. With the DA, I think it's another matter. A lot of commentators feel that they lost votes to smaller parties because they felt that their voters felt that the party wasn't consistently representing them enough. That's possibly true. I think probably the inroads that Herman Mashaba has made with Action SA probably also had a role to play there. So I think to sum that up, I think quite a lot of voters for both of the leading parties have begun to lose trust in them.
And you, in your writing this week, have suggested that the best option actually for the DA and the ANC at this point is for them to come together in most of these hung councils and form what you've described as a super coalition. What would it look like, and why is that the best option, especially for voters?
Well, we feel that there are a couple of factors about these local elections that are very indicative. One is that about a third of the councils are hung. That means to say that the voters couldn't give a clear mandate to one or the other of the leading parties at all in about a third of the cases of the councils, and that's quite significant in itself. It means a lot of people simply can't balance up their commitments to the parties. The other point is, I think that clearly the lack of trust in the parties means that neither is performing well enough. To summarize, the ANC has failed to deliver services to many of the communities it should have delivered to, and by all accounts, the DA is rather selective in the way it delivers services. So if you put that together with the lack of the decline in trust in the parties, it seems that there's a strong possibility anyway. We feel that it would be better for them to work together, especially if you consider that together, even after these last elections, they control about, or the results of the last elections anyway, were that they together have about 60%, 67% of the vote of those who voted. And that's a substantial proportion in any democracy. And we feel that that should be enabled, and they should be enabling each other to exploit that, explore it, and work in a coalition, because the oppositional politics that has been so characteristic of the last couple of decades is clearly not working.
So a lot of what happens during these coalition discussions is that parties fail to meet an agreement because in some cases they differ ideologically. But at local government policy level, are the DA and ANC more similar than we realize, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. They are very similar because The issues of local government are in some ways much more direct. Local government is the point at which government reaches the people, mostly, and particularly in the area of services. And if you look at the record of many of our councils failing to deliver services, that's obviously the primary issue. And if you combine that with the observation I made earlier about the DA's sometimes rather selective delivery of services, we would be saying that the single most important issue that has emerged that can be read out of these results is services. People want services in this country, the services that the government exists to deliver. So from that point of view, the angle at the local political level is, I won't say it's a lot simpler, because obviously there's lots of dynamics in each particular community that are different from other communities. Nevertheless, some of the issues are rather more direct. It's about services and delivering them. And we think that a super coalition, as we call it, on national level, which also helps to support a coalition of the same kind at local level, will help to support the development of proper governance at that level and the delivery of services in particular.
So there has been, during the past week or so, where parties are going about discussing these coalitions, reaction from voters who said, well, I gave you my vote precisely because I can't stand Party B. And you've got a situation in South Africa where the DA voter is very suspicious of the ANC voter, well, the ANC itself as a party, and vice versa. Do you think there's a possibility then that fear of punishment by the electorate could work against a broad-based sort of coming together between the ANC and DA?
That's a very good question. It's certainly an issue that parties will always face when the possibility of a coalition arises. Certainly the smaller party going into a coalition faces challenges. Those challenges have to do with its fear that it might lose identity. It might also not be able to claim successes where successes are achieved. There are issues, clearly issues in relation to coalitions, which need to be thought out and discussed by the parties beforehand. In the piece that I wrote, which you referred to, I do say that there's lots of tools, there's lots of instruments, there's lots of organizations that are very capable in supporting quite opposed parties to form coalitions, so it's not as if there's a lack of experience or expertise in that direction. Secondly, there's a lot of countries that have used or have had coalitions, grand coalitions in that case, in the case that I'm talking about, that is to say coalitions between the leading parties in the countries, for many reasons. Sometimes those reasons have been to support or develop new approaches to a particular problem the country has faced. In other cases, it's been to solve a problem of endemic opposition between the parties, which has proved unsustainable. So, Austria, the Czech Republic, Germany is a great example of a country that has been run by coalitions for years. Japan is another one. Northern Ireland has a very effective coalition. The Netherlands, Switzerland particularly has one. Kenya introduced one for different reasons, the violence in the early 2000s, but it was relatively successful in reducing that violence. We're saying that coalitions can be an effective way of doing this, and that there are also advantages to be sought by both parties in doing so. And those advantages really have to do with realizing that in some situations, and we believe that South Africa is now in a situation like that with a dire level of delivery of services, it is important for parties to recognize their own interests, certainly, but also to realize that there is a bigger interest and that they represent people whose interests aren't necessarily directly reflected by their own interests as an organization. So in that situation, a coalition is clearly called for.
Richard Jurgens, good to speak to you. Richard is the editor of in fact the Africa governance papers. Thank you, Richard.